Think about the last meal you ate. Chances are almost none of it was raw. Meat, vegetables, grains, cooked, nearly all of it, without you giving that fact a second thought. It's so automatic that it barely registers as a choice anymore. One researcher argues that this ordinary, unremarkable habit might be the single biggest reason you have the brain you're currently using to think about it. The easy assumption is that cooking was a nice discovery, maybe even an accident. Meat left too close to a fire, found to taste better, adopted because it was convenient and pleasant. Under that version of the story, cooking is a footnote, an improvement in comfort, not a turning point in human evolution. The researcher making the opposite case is Richard Wrangham, and his argument is considerably bigger than cooking tastes good. He argues that controlled cooking, more than the switch to eating meat itself, is what allowed the human gut to shrink and the human brain to grow. Here's the logic behind that claim. Your brain is metabolically expensive. It consumes roughly a quarter of your entire body's energy budget just to run, which is an enormous share for a single organ. Getting enough usable energy to support an organ that's costly requires either eating a huge amount of food or getting significantly more calories out of the same amount of food. Cooking does the second thing. Heat breaks down tough proteins and starches before they ever reach your stomach, which means your digestive system has to do far less work to extract the same energy. Less digestive effort translates into more net calories actually available to fuel something like a rapidly growing brain. Stop and consider how strange that trade actually is. A body spending less effort breaking food down sounds like a minor convenience. But over evolutionary time, energy saved anywhere is energy that becomes available somewhere else. And an organ as expensive as the brain is exactly the kind of place that spare energy could get redirected toward, generation after generation, if the savings were consistent enough. There's fossil evidence that lines up with this story in a genuinely striking way. Around 1.8 million years ago, the fossil record shows a transition from Homo habilis to Homo erectus, and the changes aren't small. Jaws got smaller. Teeth got smaller. Guts, inferred from ribcage shape, appear to have shrunk as well. At the same time, cranial capacity increased by roughly 42%. Smaller digestive and chewing equipment, paired with a dramatically bigger brain, is exactly the trade-off you'd expect if a species had shifted toward food that required far less mechanical and digestive effort to process, food that had already been broken down by something other than teeth and stomach acid. Cooking fits that description precisely. There's even experimental support for the underlying mechanism, using an unlikely test subject: pythons. Researchers have used pythons as a model for studying digestive effort, because their gut responses to different foods are easy to measure directly. Pythons fed cooked food expend measurably less digestive effort processing it than pythons fed the same food raw. That's not proof about ancient humans specifically, but it does demonstrate concretely that cooking's digestive advantage isn't just a plausible story. It's a measurable biological effect. So far, this sounds like a clean, well-supported case. Here's where it gets genuinely contested, and where a careful version of this story has to slow down. The proposed timeline puts the shift toward cooked food at around 1.8 million years ago, right alongside the rise of Homo erectus. but direct archaeological evidence of controlled fire use, actual hearths, burned material clearly linked to deliberate human activity, only reliably extends back to roughly 800,000 years ago. That's a gap of a full million years between the biological changes Wrangham's hypothesis is built to explain and the physical evidence of the technology his hypothesis says caused them. Critics of the cooking hypothesis point directly at that gap. If early Homo erectus was cooking regularly enough to reshape its own jaw, teeth, gut, and brain, where is the corresponding trail of ancient hearths that old? Fire evidence does degrade over time, which makes the earliest traces genuinely hard to find and preserve. That's a real, legitimate limitation of the archaeological record, not just an excuse. But the evidence is hard to preserve, and the evidence exists but hasn't been found yet are different claims than the evidence has actually been found. And right now, for that earliest period, it hasn't. Some researchers have proposed a middle path. Maybe fire use started small and inconsistent, opportunistic rather than fully controlled, well before it became the kind of regular, deliberate hearth building that leaves a clear archaeological signature. That would explain the gap without abandoning the cooking hypothesis entirely. Early, patchy fire use might simply be almost invisible in the fossil and sediment record, even if it was already changing what early humans could digest. So you're left with two things that are both true at once, and a good answer holds onto both instead of picking the more satisfying one. The biological evidence, smaller jaws, smaller teeth, a smaller gut, a much bigger brain, all changing together around 1.8 million years ago, fits the cooking hypothesis remarkably well. The direct physical evidence for fire doesn't yet reach back far enough to confirm that cooking was actually happening at the time those biological changes occurred. One of those facts makes the hypothesis compelling, the other keeps it from being proven. Bring this back to your own body for a second. You could not survive well on a fully raw diet the way a chimpanzee can. Human teeth, human jaw muscles, and the human gut are all measurably smaller and less powerful than what a close relative living on raw food needs. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a modern weakness. It's consistent with a species that offloaded a huge share of its digestive work onto fire, generation after generation, for so long that the body itself changed shape around the assumption that food would arrive already broken down by heat. That dependency cuts both ways. It's arguably what freed up the metabolic budget for the brain you're using right now. It's also why raw food diets are genuinely harder for modern humans to thrive on long-term than they are for other apes. Your digestive system was never built to be self-sufficient the way theirs still is. Whatever cooking actually did to your ancestors, it left its mark on the body you're living in today. Whether or not the exact date it started can be pinned down. It's a strange kind of inheritance. Most of what you think of as uniquely human, language, tools, culture, feels like it lives in the brain. This one lives just as much in your jaw, your teeth, and your gut. Quieter evidence, easy to overlook, sitting in the shape of your own body every time you sit down to eat. So here's the best current answer, held with the honesty this topic actually requires. Cooking almost certainly mattered enormously to human evolution. The biological case for it, in the shape of ancient jaws, teeth, guts, and skulls, is genuinely strong. Whether that shift began as early as 1.8 million years ago, alongside the rise of Homo erectus, remains a compelling but unproven hypothesis, because the direct physical evidence for fire use doesn't yet extend back that far. This is a case where an influential, well-reasoned idea and the currently available proof haven't fully caught up to each other, and that gap is exactly what future discoveries could close, one way or the other. Here's a question for the comments. If you had to guess, do you think earlier fire evidence is still out there waiting to be found, or do you think the timeline itself needs to be revised? Next time, we're moving from what was on the menu to who got a seat at the table. How did early humans figure out who could actually be trusted?